Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our ONR webinar this afternoon. I'm Katie Day, ONR's Director of Policy and Communications, and I'm your host this afternoon. We're often asked about the impact of natural or man-made disasters on the nuclear industry and how prepared our licensees are to deal with unforeseen events. While licensees have no control over earthquakes, plane crashes, or sea level rises, as the regulator, we must make sure that they have measures in place to deal with those external hazards. So today, we'll be talking more about the work that we do to regulate the industry and how it manages the risks arising from external hazards. This will include providing you with an overview of our recently updated External Hazards Technical Assessment Guide, a detailed document that covers seismic events, coastal flooding, meteorological hazards, amongst others. And we'll also give you some details about the role of our External Hazards Panel, which provides expert advice to us. I'm joined this afternoon by our Chief Nuclear Inspector, Mark Foy.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Tim Allmark, who is our Professional Lead for External Hazards.
Good afternoon.
And Tanya Macleod, who's our Principal Inspector for External Hazards.
Hello, everyone.
In a few moments, Tim and Tanya will take you through a presentation, and thereafter we should have around 30 minutes or so for questions, finishing up by about 4:30. Just a little bit of guidance before we get started on how the webinar will work today. We're fortunate that lots of you have been able to join us this afternoon. I think we may have a few still joining. But to make the best use of the time we have, can I ask that you hold off putting questions to us until after the presentation is done and when we get to that part of the webinar. And also, if you can make questions as succinct as possible and kept within the scope of the subject matter for this afternoon. If you do have a question on another subject, as ever, we're always happy to take those through our general inquiries function, and I'll provide more details on that at the end. When we do get to the questions, you should see a QA box somewhere on the left-hand side of your screen where you can submit them. I'd ask you to reserve the chat function that you'll see on your screens and the raise the hand function for just highlighting any technical issues such as lack of sound. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark to give you a brief introduction before Tim and Tanya head into their presentation. Mark.
Thank you very much, Katie. As Katie has said, welcome to this latest of our webinar series on external hazards. I think it's worthwhile just putting into context why we've chosen this particular topic. Previously, we've always identified topics for the webinar that we think would be of interest to you without much consultation, and it's coincided with some specific activity that we have been undertaking over the previous period of time. However, through a number of engagements with the NGO community and also through the FOI requests and questions for information that have come in, it's become quite apparent to us that the topic of external hazards is something that is of real interest to many stakeholders that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Hence, we've come forward with this particular webinar now that is focused in that area of interest. We've sought to provide, as part of the discussion, two of our key people in the area of external hazards. Tim, as we said, is the professional lead, and he's responsible for our technical ability in this area, our capability, the staff that we have undertaking the assessments, and also the standards against which we hold the industry against. And then Tanya, as one of the specialist inspectors in this area, does the day-to-day assessment of submissions and inspections on site in this area. Hopefully, as a result of the webinar today, we will provide you with confidence in our approach in ensuring that external hazards is given full and due consideration by duty holders and licensees within the nuclear industry, such that we ourselves get satisfied with regards to the level of safety that has been demonstrated, and that you can have confidence in that as well. We'll also look to provide you with some information on climate change, because I know there have been many questions that have come into ourselves around climate change associated with external hazards, which I know is of great interest to all of you. Following that, we'll then go on to the questions and answers, as Katie has said, where we can hopefully resolve any issues or provide you with some information that the session that Tim and Tanya are now going to lead on perhaps may not cover. So without further ado, I'll move on to the presentation that Tim and Tanya will now lead us through, and we'll then follow that with the question and answers. Tim.
Thank you, Mark. We've identified a small number of topics there. We'll be providing the introduction section of this presentation, and Tanya will continue with the remainder of it. I think the first thing that I'd like to say about external hazards is that this is not a new topic for ONR. This is something that we've considered in great detail for many, many years. And it is often the governing factor behind the design of facilities, new facilities, and the substantiation of old facilities. So it's a key part of our regulation. I've put a few images up on the screen there that you can see, and the one I want to focus on is the one in the middle, really, which is a flood wall at Dungeness B power station, which was constructed about 4 or 5 years ago in response to challenges that we gave to the licensee, which they responded to in a positive manner, and constructed this wall. It's about 2 kilometres long, 1.5 metres high. And this is an example of where we as the regulator have really been able to influence the licensee to improve their resilience against natural hazards. The remaining pictures on there show a lot of equipment for on-site and off-site response, which were provided post-Fukushima and as part of general enhancements to the site as part of the periodic safety review process that we undertake. This next slide around hazard requirements for power reactors is a little bit technical. I've put this in really to explain quite how severe the natural hazards we expect our licensees to construct safety cases against are. The design basis is shown as a 1 in 10,000 year event, or something with an annual probability of exceedance of 10 to the minus 4 to be absolutely technically precise. So this is an event that we will never have physically seen in our lifetimes, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that manifests itself later. But that isn't where we stop. We also require licensees to consider beyond that design basis, to show that there is no cliff edge beyond that. So in other words, for a small increase in the size of the design basis, there is no sudden disproportionate increase in risk to the public or workers. And the second part is that clearly we need to understand what our margin to failure actually is. How far away from getting to an uncomfortable place are we? Clearly, there are events that surprise us, natural hazards being perhaps one of the leading areas where we get surprised. And so understanding this margin and having a defence in depth approach, having clear understanding of where the cliff edges lie is key to ensuring that we are reducing risk to as low as reasonably practicable. And obviously the usual expectations in terms of redundancy, diversity, segregation and separation apply equally to natural hazards as they do to others. This next slide really is to try and explain in perhaps simpler language what a 10 to the minus 4 or 1 in 10,000 year event actually looks like. So this table shows basically from simple frequencies of once per year, i.e. your birthday, and through to 10 to the minus 8, which is mass extinction. 10 to the minus 4 is where we pitch our design basis events, and 10 to the minus 5 per year is typically where we would assess against cliff edges too. And so we're looking at events which are between major volcanic eruptions and an ice age. So that hopefully should give you some impression as to quite the rarity of the events against which we require licensees to provide protection. So with that background, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Tanya, who will walk us through the guidance that we have in place currently.
Thank you, Tim. So we do a lot of assessment at ONR to inform our permissioning activities. This consists of a review of the technical adequacy of the submissions we receive from our duty holders against the SAPs, or Safety Assessment Principles, and tags, which are technical assessment guides. The permissioning process allows ONR to control the activities of duty holders who require permission to start, continue, or cease certain activities under the relevant legislation. The SAPs provide about 400 general and discipline-specific high-level safety principles that we consider to be relevant good practice. They are available at the link displayed on the slide. The discipline-specific SAPs for external hazards are included in the EHA series of SAPs. ONR employs specialist warranted inspectors in various technical disciplines or specialisms. External hazards falls within the remit of the Civil Engineering and External Hazards Group. The tags provide discipline-specific advice on how to test safety submissions for adequacy and how to interpret the SAPs. They also set out ONR's position on various technical issues. Currently, there are over 100 tags on ONR's website. The tags primarily provide guidance to ONR inspectors, but they also provide information to licensees and duty holders regarding ONR's expectations for the nature and content of the relevant technical elements of safety cases and security plans. They are intended to be consistent with the International Atomic Energy Agency and Western European Nuclear Regulators Association's guidance. They are primarily aimed at new major hazards plant and intended to be applied proportionately to existing plant and lower hazard plant. ONR publishes the tags to ensure transparency, which is consistent with our enabling approach to regulation, and to better inform stakeholders about ONR's expectations. The tags are available at the link displayed on the slide. We encourage stakeholders to be familiar with them. The SAPs and tags constitute recognized standards and are themselves considered to represent relevant good practice. Now that I've talked a bit about SAPs and tags in general, I'm going to introduce you to the Tag 13 suite of documents. Tag 13 is the external hazards tag. The document structure for Tag 13 is set out on this slide. It is a little bit different from our other tags because it covers so much information, and therefore it is set out in several linked documents. The Tag 13 head document covers general external hazards information. It has a number of appendices on matters such as electromagnetic interference, biological hazards, industrial hazards, landscape change, and gas release. There are annexes for 4 of the most important external hazards: seismic, meteorological, coastal flood, and accidental aircraft crash hazards. The head document, appendices, and annexes were authored by the external hazards team. The annexes on seismic, meteorological, and coastal flood hazards are underpinned by expert panel papers. These were written by ONR's expert panel on natural hazards. This panel provides credible, independent advice to support ONR's own regulatory specialists in their decision-making. I will talk more about the panel in a moment. The tag head document links the relevant legislation and license conditions to generic external hazards technical considerations. It covers the themes and issues relevant to all external hazards. The appendices relate to those external hazards that we consider generally less significant. The annexes on seismic, meteorological, coastal flood, and accidental aircraft crash hazard interpret generic technical issues from the head document into specific information for these hazards. The intended audience for both of these are external hazard specialist inspectors and specialist inspectors of interfacing disciplines. Both constitute formal ONR guidance and express ONR's view. There's a standard format that is shared across all of the annexes. They start with hazards information, including a description of the hazard and plant response, and go on to describe the safety analysis we expect our licensees and duty holders to perform, followed by information on emergency planning and arrangements, a list of relevant standards and good practice, and references. There's a table of all the hazards included in these hazard groups. The expert panel papers on meteorological, coastal flooding, and seismic hazards were authored by ONR's expert panel for natural hazards. The analysis of these hazards is generally undertaken by dedicated experts and these papers provide advice and interpretation to these experts and to the external hazards team. They don't conform to a standard format, but support and are heavily referenced from these annexes. They are not intended as formal ONR guidance or to express ONR's views. ONR has an expert panel on natural hazards. This is made up of two subpanels, a seismic subpanel and a meteorological and coastal flood subpanel. The individuals on these panels have been chosen for their deep technical understanding of the subject and their ability to express their views to us. They stand and fall on their academic reputations, and therefore they provide us with independent advice. They have also been vetted to ensure they do not have any conflicts of interest in terms of involvement with nuclear developers. On the seismic side, they are Dr. Julian Baumer and Professors Bob Holsworth, Ian Main, and Dr. Jean Savvy. On the meteorological and coastal flood subpanel, our experts are Dr. Alan Gadian, Dr. Stefan Harrison, and Professors Kevin Horsberg, Mark Macklin, David Smith, and Matt Wilson. The major organizations and individuals providing significant input and review for TAC 13 are listed on this slide. We have consulted broadly with leading organizations and individuals in their fields to ensure we gain an independent range of views. Now we will turn to look at meteorological hazards. So I'd like to talk you through the primary meteorological hazards that we consider. Precipitation refers to rainfall, but also snow, hail, and ice. It can lead to flooding, and snow can also block vents and cause excessive loading on roofs. Lightning can affect electrical and electronic systems on nuclear sites. Wind could cause the collapse of structures such as stacks and masonry walls. Low air temperature can freeze water in tanks. High air temperature could cause overheating of equipment. Low and high air pressure can have an effect on open water, leading to storm surge and flood. Dust storms and sandstorms can block filters and cause equipment failures, and volcanic hazards can have a similar effect to dust storms. Extremes in humidity or moisture content, as well as the marine environment, can cause corrosion over time, leading to equipment failure. Meteorological hazards are non-discrete hazards. This means they can be characterized by a hazard curve of frequency versus severity. Major meteorological hazards such as wind, precipitation, and lightning, and combinations of these will always be identified as potentially significant and screened into the fault analysis for UK sites. This may not be the case for some hazards, however. For example, dust storms and sandstorms may be screened out in the UK. The assessment process for meteorological hazards consists of multiple steps. I will say more about data collection later. Data evaluation consists of checking the quality of the data and determining whether there are any outliers and why. Statistical analysis is performed to determine a return period. A margin is added to account for climate change. I will talk about climate change later in the presentation. A design basis is then defined against which the plant must be defined with adequate margins and avoiding any cliff edge effects. Secondary and consequential effects are then considered, for example, snowmelt leading to flooding. And design loads and parameters are then defined, for example, hydrostatic pressure on structures from flooding. So this process of considering meteorological hazards is a highly methodical method, taking into account all available data, using rigorous processes that allow us to understand the level of confidence we can have in the data and the residual uncertainty that needs to be taken into account in the design. Data can come from a variety of sources and usually include some or all of the following: paleoclimatic data from the geological record, historical accounts and records, instrumental data such as temperature, wind speed, and precipitation, and synthetic data which is generated against historical sources and climate change projections such as from UKCP 18. Statistical analysis and data processing is used to extrapolate data to longer timescales, and previous meteorological studies that have been performed by the Met Office and others can be taken into account. Now let's turn our attention to coastal flood hazards. Coastal flooding analysis is made up of a number of components. Tides are very predictable, and from a safety case perspective, they are deterministic. Storm surge is the rise in sea level during a storm caused by low pressure and wind pushing water on shore. Waves include wind-driven waves and swell waves. The influence of shoreline bathymetry, including erosion, is usually analyzed using a range of data, including light detection and ranging or LIDAR data. Long-term sea level changes are mostly due to climate change. Tsunamis are waves of long length and period that could arise from a number of sources, including submarine slides, earthquakes, or meteorite impact. Seiches are resonant effects in enclosed or semi-enclosed bodies of water. Bores are dramatic features in areas with a high tidal range, such as the Bristol Channel, and they occur on a rising tide. There are a number of issues that need to be considered when it comes to coastal flooding. I will talk about climate change later in this presentation. Short data sets from instrumental data need to be supplemented by historical and model data. In the top illustration on this slide, you can see an example of historical data. This is a woodcut showing the devastation caused by the 1607 flood of the Bristol Channel. In the middle illustration, you can see a flood marker on the Worcester Cathedral Watergate on the Severn. As for coastal erosion, the most damaging short-term erosion processes are due to wave action. Long-term effects of erosion need to be considered over the site lifetime. Third-party sea defenses may not provide a design basis level of protection or be maintained to the same standards as site defenses. Monitoring needs to be ongoing and occur pre and post-event. In the bottom photograph, you can see an RAF Chinook repairing sea defenses during the 2013 storm surge event. Boulders from Seal Sands were used to prevent further flooding at Port Clarence. In terms of aging and maintenance, plant response can be affected by physical changes to defenses, concrete degradation, and corrosion. Finally, housekeeping is important, such as restraining items that could become buoyant and could present a secondary hazard or block access. The IAEA guidance, SSG 18, on meteorological and hydrological hazards in site evaluation for nuclear installations states that for new build sites, coastal flooding protection should be provided via one of two approaches or a combination of these. The first is the dry site concept, where all vulnerable safety-related plant is above the design basis flood level, accounting for wave runup. The other option is permanent external barriers. ONR SAPs now indicate a preference for the dry site concept where reasonably practicable. Now I'd like to talk to you about climate change and specifically UKCP 18. The United Nations recognizes climate change as the most systematic threat to humankind. The UK government energy policy calls for a diverse mix of energy sources, including nuclear power, as part of the drive towards a lower carbon economy. Nuclear power plants need to be protected against the effects of climate change, and this is written into ONR guidance. ONR SAPs state that the reasonably foreseeable effects of climate change over the lifetime of the facility should be taken into account. This includes for the design basis event, which is the 1 in 10,000 annual probability of exceedance event conservatively evaluated for natural hazards. It also includes beyond design basis considerations, where we expect licensees to demonstrate that there are no cliff edge effects, which are disproportionate increases in risk near the design basis. The margin to failure also needs to be understood. Finally, we expect licensees to use the managed adaptive approach. The aim of the managed adaptive approach is to build flexibility into decisions on how best to protect infrastructure from the effects of climate change today so that they can be adjusted depending on what emerging research indicates may happen in future. The UK Climate Projections 2018 are known as UKCP 18. They have been produced by the Met Office with expert input from the Environment Agency and funded by DEFRA and BEIS. UKCP 18 updates UKCP 09 projections and provides observations and climate change projections out to 2100 in the UK and globally. ONR is a member of the government user group, which advised the UKCP 18 project on user needs. UKCP 18 is replacing UKCP 09. The headline result from UKCP 18 has not changed. It is that we can expect there to be a greater chance of warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. The image on the right shows the key inputs from UKCP 18. In the interest of time, I don't propose to go through each of these now, but there is a lot of information available on the UKCP 18 website. UKCP 09 projections were based on various emission scenarios, but UKCP 18 is based on greenhouse gas concentrations, so it is a fundamentally different approach. The UKCP 18 projections are available at higher spatial and temporal resolution than has been previously available, for example, daily and sub-daily. And there is no weather generator provided in UKCP 18. This is because in UKCP 18, data is presented from a physically based modeling system, which the Met Office believes can be better evaluated against real-world observations. The ONR, Environment Agency, and Natural Resources Wales joint position statement on UKCP 18 was published on ONR's website in March 2019. It provides more detail than I can cover today on our expectations for the use of UKCP 18, but I will summarize these over the next two slides. The use of UKCP 18 is considered to be relevant good practice in determining climate change allowances for relevant natural hazards at GB licensed sites. Although we do not consider it necessary to transition from UKCP 09 to UKCP 18 immediately, any new analysis of climate change should make use of UKCP 18. For existing sites, the implications of UKCP 18 for climate change considerations should be taken into account during LC15 periodic safety reviews. We expect our duty holders to provide evidence that the UKCP 18 RCP selected results in an adequately conservative design basis in accordance with the ONR's SAPs. Regardless of the RCP selected, sensitivity studies are also needed against the more onerous scenarios, including H++, which are physically plausible extreme climate change scenarios. Duty holders will also be expected to ensure there is no disproportionate increase in risk for events more severe than the design basis. And I have talked a bit earlier about the managed adaptive approach. This is discussed in more detail in the ONR and EA document, Principles for Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management, which is available on our website. I thought I would go through a few key facts from UKCP 18. By the end of the 21st century, all areas of the UK are projected to be warmer, more so in summer than in winter. For London, sea level rise by the end of the century, when compared to 1981 through 2000, for the low emission scenario, is very likely to be in the range of 0.29 meters to 0.7 meters. For a high emission scenario, the range is very likely to be 0.53 meters to 1.15 meters. Due to the new treatment of land ice contribution to sea level rise, UKCP 18 is higher than UKCP 09. For example, the upper end of the range of sea level rise in UKCP 18 for the high emission scenario for London is around 25 centimeters higher than in UK CPO 9 at 2100. This is not unexpected and has been factored into current adaptation planning. Finally, I have a slide on the Hinkley Point C site specifically. Hinkley Point C received consent for nuclear island concrete in November 2018, following generic design assessment and site licensing. Coastal flooding is part of the external hazards assessment. The Hinkley Point C coastal flooding safety case has been assessed against ONR SAPs, including the external hazards series of SAPs and all of the analysis these require. The site is protected from flooding by the platform height and is protected from waves via a wave return wall. The site has applied the managed adaptive approach by retaining space to build a setback wall if climate change indicates that this is needed. Hinkley Point C is a dry site with margins of over a meter in accordance with the definition I gave earlier in this presentation. And they have used a range of methodologies to demonstrate that their protection against coastal flooding is adequate, including joint probabilities of high sea levels and wave heights. In future, ONR will continue to engage with the licensee, which is NNB Genco. We will permission future hold points and operation along with periodic safety reviews.
Many thanks, Tanya. Tim, did you have any final remarks to make before we move to questions?
I think what I would like to say is that I hope that this has demonstrated both the seriousness that we take external hazards. It's taken us nearly 2 years to derive and develop this set of guidance. We've taken comments and advice from a very wide range of stakeholders to genuinely understand the full range of views of people engaged in this activity across the UK. Our expert panels are full of individuals who are not shy about coming forward and telling us we've not got things right. They genuinely provide us with independent and challenging views on our thinking, and it's very welcome. The guidance we have is substantial now. It's over 300 pages in length, and it has been welcomed broadly by a lot of people who are using it as giving much clearer understanding of what it is that we are looking for within our duty holders' safety cases. So I don't think I want to say anything more than that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tim. I'm just going to invite Mark to see if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, just a couple of comments from myself. Hopefully from what you've heard from both Tim and especially Tanya there, does highlight the seriousness with which we do treat external hazards and the depth and rigor that we go to actually assess justifications that are presented to us. We do treat it very seriously, and we also ensure that we keep up to date, both within our own thinking, within ONR and the standards that we set, but also by seeking to base our approach on factual evidence and by consulting with a wide range of stakeholders. So hopefully you've gained confidence, and now hopefully we can hear some questions from yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Well, we've got our first question in from David Lowry. So I'll pull the question out, and hopefully Tim and Tanya can give us some views on this. So David's asked us about our technical assessment guide on accidental aircraft crashes. It states it uses the so-called burn model to characterize such accidents. What is the equivalent model for deliberate crashes of aircraft into UK nuclear facilities in a 9/11 type terrorist attack? For example, a fully laden cargo plane hijacked just after takeoff with a full kerosene load. Tim, Tanya, can I invite you to offer some comments on that?
I think it's important to separate out accidental aircraft crash from malicious aircraft crash. Malicious aircraft crash is treated separately. We have expectations of licensees, which I'm unable to go into in a public forum. But suffice it to say that the demands that we ask of them are substantial. And if you look at our GDA reports for new design particularly, there is certainly more detail in there over our expectations in this regard.
Thanks very much, Tim. Okay. over to you guys. Anything, other questions you'd like to put to us? Okay, we've got one here from Alan. How does the 1 in 10,000 year event equate to the 4 in 70 years events of wind scale, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl and Fukushima? Are these what you would call black swan events? So I think, Tanya, are you able to give us a view on that one?
Yes, I'm happy to. So the 1 in 10,000 year event is many orders of magnitude more severe than the 4 in 70 year events. And so these would be very much bounded by the 1 in 10,000 year event that we require for our design basis. They are not what we would call black swan events, and not even close.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I'll move us on to our next question, which is another one from David, referencing the fact that Tanya mentioned nuclear is considered low carbon as part of the UK government climate change mitigation policy. It is. BEIS have talked widely about that. And David asking, what does ONR consider nuclear? Why doesn't ONR consider nuclear as low carbon if the full nuclear fuel cycle is taken into account? I'm going to invite Mark to respond to that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's not particularly an external hazards focused question. It's more in relation to nuclear policy, government policy. And government policy at the moment, David, is that nuclear is part of the UK's low carbon energy mix for the future. That's not our decision, and we're just reflecting language that the government uses in that respect.
I'll move us on. We've got another question here from Mike Taylor. Mike's asking, how do ONR take account of a neighbouring live reactor in site licensing?
Do you want me to take that one, Tanya?
That would be great. Thanks, Tim.
We take account of it in any number of ways. We take account of it in terms of the industrial threat that it might pose to a new reactor site adjacent to it, in terms of ejecting missiles from turbine disintegration, for example. We also take account of it in terms of the requirement for emergency arrangements between adjacent sites. So in the extreme event of something going wrong on the first site, that the second site has adequate arrangements in place to ensure that they can protect their workers accordingly. So there is an awful lot of consideration goes on in the site licensing process to ensure that any threat from the existing site is captured within the new site's safety justifications.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'm going to ask Mark to take the next question if you're happy, which is the use of the word proportionate can be used wrongly. Who is the arbitrator of the truth in its use?
So with regards to the word proportionate and its application, we judge whether we apply, first of all, our resources in a proportionate manner. And what I mean by proportionate is that it is targeted appropriately at the areas of more significant risk. So we will give attention to those facilities that we think present the highest hazard, highest risk and such like, and we'll review any submissions or any activities accordingly in that respect. With regards as to who is the arbiter, with relation to all the key decisions that we make, we actually put all of the information out on our website so that the public, or indeed NGOs or any other stakeholders, can look at the level and degree of attention that we have given to a particular activity or a submission. And we are open to any comments being made and questions and challenges with regard to that application, and whether there is a need perhaps to revisit it for whatever reason.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm turned down to Peter Burt's question. Peter, glad you found the presentation helpful. You've put 2 questions to us. I'll take the first one. What steps are taken to account for cumulative effects? For example, the situation where the impacts of an external extreme event are exacerbated by other factors. For example, flooding exacerbated by inappropriate development in the locality. And I think Tanya's going to answer that one for us.
Thank you for the question, Peter. If you have a look in our Tag 13 head document, you will see that we expect our licensees to take into account combinations of hazards. So these are hazards that occur at the same time, or whose effects occur at the same time, even if the hazards themselves are somewhat separated in time. So this is one of our expectations, and we we assess this in terms of our nuclear safety case submissions that we receive from licensees.
Thank you very much. I'll take Peter's second question while we're on that space. So Peter's asked, can you give us an example of a situation where there has been an expert challenge to ONR on extreme natural hazards issues and what action was taken? So perhaps you can give us a bit of a feel, Tanya, for how the expert panel members perhaps have been involved.
Yes, I can certainly do that. I was going to give the example of the 700 comments that we received on our external hazards tag. We engaged in a wide consultation on this tag with industry and with experts, with academia. We held a presentation here in our auditorium in Bootle and invited challenge both live and in terms of the comments. We received 700 comments and we took many of them into account, and we responded to every single one of those comments. So we welcome challenge, and we are constantly challenging ourselves as well.
Thank you, Tanya. David, I'm just going to come back to your question in a moment. I'm going to just continue on the theme of the external hazards for now. So we've got a question here from Hugo asking about the UK CP18 data, asking which climate scenario, RC 8.5, 6.0. I'm hoping Tanya and Tim understand those a little better than I do. And they're asking which do ONR suggest should be used. So I think, Tanya, can you answer that one for us?
Yes, thank you, Hugo. So in terms of the RCP to use from UK CP18, ONR is a non-prescriptive regulator, and our requirement is that our licensees use an adequately conservative RCP, and that they do this to a 1 in 10,000 year return period, and using a standard, at least one standard deviation above the mean. The RCP selected can vary depending on the licensee's arguments and on the strength of their safety case in terms of the protection measures they provide. So we take every case on its merits and we consider it holistically rather than focusing in and requiring one particular RCP to be used. But this is definitely an area that will attract significant regulatory attention and assessment.
Thanks, Tanya. David, I'll come back to your question, which I'm going to ask Mark to answer. You've asked, why does ONR give credence to IAEA safety guidance when the IAEA conflates its safety and security roles?
Okay, thank you for the question, David. I think it's recognised globally that the IAEA safety guidance and safety standards represent relevant good practice in relation to the standards against which the nuclear industry should be held against. They also produce security guidance and security standards for exactly the same reason. And all nations that are part of the IAEA actually aspire to and seek to comply with those standards that are set. What I would say is that ideally, one would look to work in an integral way when applying both safety and security standards. And indeed, ONR, when we regulate both safety and security, looks to ensure that we adopt an integrated approach with regards to our regulation in that respect. Another point I would make is that in developing those safety and security guidance, standards, requirements, and such like, they are developed by member states. And the UK is a member state and plays a significant role in developing and producing both safety and security standards and guidance document. So from my perspective as the UK regulator, I have no problem at all about us looking to apply the relevant good practice that is embedded in the IAEA safety and security guidance.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm going to move on to Andy Blower's question now, where he's asked, are there any circumstances in which ONR would rule out nuclear development in coastal locations vulnerable to coastal processes, floods and storm surges? There's a second part of the question, but perhaps we could deal with that element question first. Tim and Tanya, would you be happy to take that?
Yeah, clearly siting policy is the responsibility of BEIS rather than ONR in the first instance. Having said that, we clearly provide advice to BEIS on certain aspects and around siting. So even if a site were found to be suitable by BEIS for development, when we came through to licensing process, we would then re-examine these issues at that time to confirm that an appropriate understanding by the potential licensee was held to secure the safety of the site for its full projected lifetime, including that for any waste stores that may be on the site. And that may include an understanding of whether waste could indeed be moved from the site should events turn out to be rather more severe in future than we think currently.
Great, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, just to supplement what Tim has said there, Tim's quite right. It's the government that determines the details of the siting policy with regards to the deployment of a reactor across the UK or across Great Britain. What I would say is that we do work with the government, in this particular instance, BEIS, with regards to its site selection criteria and its site selection policy. And as Tim has said there, if at some particular juncture in the future, a site is selected and we come to then look at the site safety justification, it may be determined that it isn't appropriate for that reactor to be deployed at that site because of our assessment around the external hazards issue.
And Andy, you've asked a supplementary element to the question about our site conditions beyond 2100 taken into account, given that spent fuel stores will remain on site far into the next century and perhaps indefinitely. I'm just going to refer back, Mark, I think you've sort of given an overall position about how the siting process works, and conditions such as those would be considered when we came to licensing. But Tim, do you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think, as I mentioned before, when we examine licensing, we examine the full lifetime of the facility, including spent fuel stores, as part of our licensing decision. So if that requires material to remain on site beyond 2100, then yes, we would.
Okay.
So in relation to that as well, there's a requirement besides the site licensing, and we would look at the site safety case that's submitted at that particular time. Within that will be the assessment against all hazardous conditions, external hazards, etc., which look at that return frequency of 1 in 10,000 years that was touched upon by Tanya. But the periodic safety review will require the licensee to continue to look at its safety case and the safety of its activities and its operations for the foreseeable operating period of that facility, and also consider decommissioning beyond that.
I'm going to move us on. David, I know we've answered a few of your questions, so I've got quite a few backing up from other people here. So I'm just going to turn to one or two others for a moment, and hopefully we'll have time to answer some more at the end. If we don't, we will come back to them separately. I've got a question here from John. There is movement towards using small and advanced module reactors, with one of the advantages cited being the ability to situate them nearer to urban centres. As we know, this is an area of developing government policy, but you have asked us, would this affect the ONR's views on their safety case? Again, I'm going to ask Mark if he wants to offer a view on that one.
Just in response to that, no, it will not. Regardless of the type of technology, it will still be required to meet the same standards that we've set down for all nuclear facilities. So if we're undertaking an assessment and setting standards in terms of undertaking assessments against external hazards for the 1 in 10,000 year return period, that would still have to be applied to advanced modular reactors or advanced nuclear technologies. So regardless of where that reactor is sited, it would still have to provide and submit to us a rigorous assessment in that respect.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to move to Mike's question. It looks like a follow-up question here. Mike Taylor is saying concern has been expressed that changes to, for example, flood protection has increased flood risk to neighbouring communities. Mike, this is something I know we've spoken about a few times, and he's asked the question, who would be liable? Tanya, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for the question. So it's the Environment Agency who examine changes to flood protection causing increased risk to neighboring communities as part of their FRA, their flood risk assessment. So this does not fall within ONR's FIREs. We're focused on nuclear safety. This is a matter for the Environment Agency, and they are actively involved in assessing this for all nuclear sites under consideration.
And Mike, I know we're busily trying to get something set up for a meeting around with the Sizewell C group. So perhaps we can explore that a little bit more, a joint meeting with ourselves and with the Environment Agency. So happy to take that. I'm going to move us back now, David, to your question, following on from your earlier one about the IEA. So David has asked, why does ONR give credence to the IEA safety guidance in benchmarking its external hazards approach when the IEA conflates its supranational safety role with its nuclear promotional role, such as in the Nuclear Power and Mitigation of Climate Change conference in the autumn?
Okay, David, I think this question follows on very much from the one that you asked previously. With regards to the safety guidance, I am very comfortable with regards to the standards that are being set within that safety guidance. That safety guidance is developed, as I said, by member states, and it's developed, and the member states are represented by their own national regulatory bodies. And one of the criteria really around national regulators is that they are independent of their own governments. So you have those national regulators with regards to making safety decisions, actually developing guidance that I think does reflect relevant good practice and the appropriate standards by which we should be holding the industry to account. The point about the supranational safety role conflicting with its nuclear promotion role, I don't think really there is an issue there for us as national regulators. As I say, we are sovereign regulators. Promotion definitely for ONR in the UK of the industry is not an issue for us. We don't do it. We are agnostic. We are neutral, and all our decisions are made on that basis.
And indeed, we're completely independent from the government department that is responsible for it, and our sponsorship arrangements sit with the Department for Work and Pensions to support that independence. I'm going to just move on again to someone else. We've got another question here from Peter Burt. Peter, glad we provided some helpful answers previously. You've asked us, is the 1 in 10,000 year return period adequate for very long-term functions such as geological disposal of higher level wastes? I'm looking across to Tim and Tanya to see if they wanted to offer a view on that one. I think there's a short answer, which is, as we know, the geological disposal policy is still very much a work in progress. I'm going to just check if I think it's one we've got more work to do on and explore.
Yeah, it's an area that's very much in the embryonic stage of development for us in the external hazards arena, and it's running in tandem with government policy at the moment. So it would be, I can't really say too much more than that at this time.
I think, as you can hear from Tim there's a lot of work still to be done, Peter, on this, even so far as to say that it's still not a licensable facility. So ONR issues nuclear site licenses for prescribed activities. Those prescribed activities are clearly set down in regulations, and at the moment, the long-term or the final geological disposal of high-level waste is not defined as a prescribed activity. So we are working closely with government in that respect. It is likely to become a prescribed activity, although that is not clearly defined just as yet. At that point, we would start to look at it, develop what we think are the appropriate requirements for that geological disposal facility, particularly around external hazards. And in doing that, because I know that many other nations across the globe are looking at geological disposal or final disposal, we would consider the approaches being taken by other nations.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to move to Alan's question. How often do you think periodic safety reviews, how often do you do periodic safety reviews as regards rising sea levels? The Environment Agency recently said you can't just keep going higher and higher with walls, I think is your question, Alan. So I'm looking at Tanya. Are you wanting to offer a view there?
Yes, I can answer this. So we expect our licensees to perform periodic safety reviews every 10 years, and this is written into our license conditions. It's license condition 15. In terms of building higher and higher walls, it's the managed adaptive approach isn't about building walls higher and higher. It's about building flexibility into decisions today so that they can be adjusted depending on what happens in the future. So it's about building in the ability to adjust an option should it be required, flexible options. We expect our licensees to consider from the start how they may provide additional protection in future. And they have a range of options that they can call upon to do this.
That's great. Thank you, Tanya. David, you've asked us a question about whether there's a full list of qualifications of all the members of the External Hazards Panel available. What I would say is we have just issued a briefing to our NGO forum to give a little bit more detail on the External Hazards Panel. That should have been with you on Tuesday. I think possibly we can take that question offline and have a look and see what additional information we might be able to provide.
Yeah, certainly first port of call would be the websites of the universities that the bulk of these people work at, where you'll find a plethora of information on their research and academic qualifications.
We'll be making the slides available, David, on our website, so you'll be free to refer back to names and check any information that you'd want to in that respect. Now, I've got two more questions here, and then I think we're gonna have to move to wrapping up things. So I've got a question from Paul Clegg here. Is there any expectation for licensees to demonstrate resilience of infrastructure beyond the licensed site, for example, to support off-site emergency response? Tim or Mark?
I'm quite happy to sort of fill
Thanks,
that first
Mark.
off. Yes, there is. So some of the photographs that Tim had on the screen there were the post-Fukushima improvements that EDF put in place with regards to heavy equipment, heavy plant that could be deployed either on the site or local to the site to assist in any emergency response that was necessary. So such things as heavy diggers, earth movers, and such like. With regards to the new requirements around emergency preparedness and response that's coming out of the Basic Safety Standards Directive that was issued by the European Union or the European Commission, we're currently developing an approved code of practice, but that looks at the planning areas around nuclear facilities and nuclear sites, and there has to be predefined plans in place to allow a timely and an appropriate response to nuclear events and incidents that may occur on a nuclear site that does have off-site repercussions. And as part of that, a coordinated response is necessary, and part of that coordinated response may call upon the licensee, the duty holder, the operator of the site to actually lend assistance.
And the approved code of practice is currently out as consultation, as Mark said, and is available on our website as well. I'm going to go to David's final question, and then I'm afraid I think we're going to have to wrap up here because we're close on 4:30. David's asked, how does the ONR approach deal with combined hazards, such as the development of liquid natural gas terminal near Hunterston, or a coal mine near Sellafield, or fracking near Springfield's fuel fabrication plant, where both the nuclear plant and external development are potentially individually hazardous and potentially synergistically catastrophic? And I think I'm going to look across to Tim to offer a view on that one.
Thank you. As ONR, clearly we're responsible for regulating the nuclear industry. We're not responsible for regulating coal mining or LNG terminals, etc. However, what we do is we have a planning function within our organisation where we will receive notification, advance notification of planning requests for these kind of installations, and we will discuss with the licensee what their understanding of the threats posed to their facility are. We will also undertake independent reviews of those threats, and where appropriate we will make representation to the planning authorities and to licensees around these issues. And this is something that we do on a regular basis.
And I think, David, you might recall that at our last NGO forum that Dr. Anthony Hart, our Director for Technical Division, actually gave a presentation about our role in some of the land use planning. Again, those slides are available on our website, and there's further details about our role in that process. I'm very sorry, folks, but we're going to have to wrap proceedings up. I think we've got to all the questions that certainly came up on the screen, but if you've got any follow-up questions for us on this afternoon's topic, please do get in touch via our contact@onr.gov.uk account. As I said earlier, we will be making the slides available And we're taking a recording of the webinar, I think, as usual. So we'll be making the audio transcript available on the website too. My thanks to Mark, to Tim, and to Tanya for their time. I'm just giving the opportunity to offer any final comments or thoughts.
No, I hope that you're left with an impression that we do treat external hazards seriously and that we have a rigorous approach to assessing it, but also to ensuring that we reflect the latest situation, the latest thinking with regards to external hazards and how they are impacted by climate change. But thank you for participating. I think the questions were really, really incisive this time.
And thank you, Tim and Tanya, as well, for a great presentation this afternoon. As ever, we want to know what you think of us and how the webinar's been for you this afternoon. So you should now on your screens see a short feedback questionnaire, just 3 questions. And if you could let us know how you felt about the webinar, that would be really appreciated. We're doing more webinars this year. We're expecting to do a further one over the summer, focusing on the development of our new strategy for 2020 to 2025. There'll be more details available on that in due course. All I can do now is to say thank you once again for taking part this afternoon, and we can hope you can join us in the future. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.